We are thrilled to have with us for this important conversation. Leading today's discussion is the incredible Tony J. Westbrook Jr., a first-year Ziegler Rabbinical student, an award-winning Jewish African-American activist, educator, and community leader. Tony has been a champion for racial justice and equity in the Jewish world, facilitating training sessions across, numerous organizations. He's also the recipient of the Covenant Foundation's 2021 Pomegranate Prize for Emerging Leaders in Jewish Education. Tony continues to inspire and shape the Jewish community. We are honored to have him with us today. Without further ado, Tony, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Westbrook. I am so excited to be here with you all today and to introduce a truly inspiring voice who will guide us through today's conversation. So please share any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those in the final 15 minutes or so of today's webinar. Today, we have the incredible Liz Kleinrock, an incredible author, anti-bias, anti-racist educator, consultant, and facilitator. Liz works with schools, organizations, and companies nationwide to foster equity and inclusion. As a transracial adoptee born in South Korea and raised in Washington, D.C., Liz brings a deeply personal and professional perspective to this work. Caroline Pritchard, who has dedicated her career to education from teaching third graders to shaping federal policy. Caroline is the author of Giddy and Kvetch, named a Tablet Magazine Best Jewish Picture Book of 2021, as well as Where is Poppy? Caroline regrets being unable to attend today, but Liz will surely be a fabulous representation of the two and of their book. We are so honored to have you here today. So let's dive in.
Thank you so much, Tony. Really happy to be here in conversation with you today.
So this fantastic book, What Jewish Looks Like, I'm curious, what inspired you to write the book? Was there a specific moment or experience that made you feel like this book needed to be written?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't think I would say there is one really specific moment, more of a series of moments that I experienced from childhood up until insert very recent date. Presenting the way that I do, being Korean and Korean American, shockingly, when I think a lot of people might close their eyes and imagine somebody who is Jewish, they're typically not going to imagine somebody who looks like me. There were certainly plenty of ouch moments and pain points from growing up, being in Jewish community spaces, if it be synagogue or Hebrew school or Jewish summer camp, where I felt like I was often put in a position to defend my Jewishness, or offer an explanation or receipts or something like that. And often hearing that response when people found out that I was Jewish of, well, you don't look Jewish. And especially as a child, not really having the language or tools to know how to respond to that, except being kind of lost for words or say well, I am, and that's really all I can offer here. And so really that's where the title came from, was receiving all those comments and knowing from, many other friends, colleagues who are also Jewish people of color, that this is not something that's been unique to me. It's something that is almost very universal amongst Jewish people of color, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. As a Black Jewish rabbinical school student, I'm often asked or told that I don't look Jewish or my name doesn't sound Jewish. And so I'm excited that we're going to really sort of dive into your book today. And so much of your personal experience, I think, just as you shared, is really a universal experience for other Jews of color. And curious of, what is the core message that you want your readers to walk away with from this book?
Sure. I mean, I think I could break that response down into to thinking about hopeful messages for people who do identify as Jewish and then people outside the Jewish community as well. I think for people who are not Jewish, there are a number of stereotypes I think that many of us are aware of that exist about Jewish people, that, we present in a particular way, that we all have the same ancestry, the same history, the same lived experiences, and that is not true at all. So when you say something like, oh, well, that person is Jewish, like they don't look Jewish, like that's really you buying into a particular bias or stereotype that exists somewhere in your mind based on, images or things that you might have seen or accumulated through like books or media or the news, that actually don't apply to all Jewish people. It's like a very limited perspective. And even within the Jewish community too, like those things also exist. A story that I have shared before, as an educator. I've taught all different grades of elementary school. But in one particular class, I remember doing lessons about Jewish American Heritage Month and asking students, like from an inquiry perspective, what do you know about Jewish people? Like, what do you know about Jewish history? And having like a very proud Jewish child in fourth grade raise his hand and say, well, like, I know that there are two main groups of Jewish people. Like there are Ashkenazi Jews and there are Sephardic Jews. And saying, like, yes, like those are two different like ethnic subgroups in the Jewish community. And there are also a lot more than that too. And like without missing a beat, this child just goes, yeah, I know, but like those are the two most important ones. And so even within the Jewish community, children, especially, I think, are still receiving messages around social hierarchy about who is the most dominant, who deserves to be seen, who is the most important. And I do think that there is like a lack of text out there and like media and resources to really try to counter a lot of those ideas. And so I'm hoping that this book begins at least to have some of those conversations with young people. And frankly, let's be real, like adults too.
So true. Um, I I love that. I used to work in a religious school, and very quickly realized that my little pre-kindergartners and kindergarten age students really, they were just starting to notice the differences, and we were very lucky that we had a very diverse class of students, but found that most of the books on the shelves really only told one story or one kind of story, and most of those people looked fairly similar. And so we were always very excited when there was, a Sephardic Hanukkah book that made its way into our classroom. Um, and part of reading your book, I think what you're trying to do, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is really sort of breaking stereotypes around what a Jew looks like, who a Jew is, and your title challenges the notion that there's a singular way to look and to do Jewish. How do you hope the book will influence future conversations about representation and identity within the Jewish community and beyond?
I hope that when folks pick this up, I imagine that for some people there might be some defensiveness because cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, especially in thinking, well, I think I have all of this like really robust knowledge about Jewish people and history and identity, and perhaps picking this up might make you realize, oh, I actually have a lot of awareness gaps in my own understanding, and that can be, again, like really uncomfortable. I'm hoping that folks, if like people do fall into that category, that they can really try to work through that discomfort and think about, okay, then what are those lacking experiences I had in my own Jewish education growing up? Certainly, like Hebrew schools and Sunday schools, I think have a huge responsibility of educating young Jewish people about our peoplehood from a very diverse and like global perspective. And also thinking about for like our mainstream schools, like I've been an educator for my entire career, the very limited type of representation of Jewish people, like in our schools and in curriculum. Because for most folks, like when I lead professional development, if I ask, did you learn anything, if at all, about Jewish people in your own K-12 education? The answer most of the time is no. And if the answer is yes, it's usually just limited to the Holocaust. So
Hmm.
you're only learning about Jewish people in our present day and age from a historical lens. And so there isn't anything that's modern or really like present that's happening in the world today. It's also only through the lens of victimhood and oppression. And while that is certainly an enormous part of the Jewish story globally, we're so much more than that. Something that I find myself coming back to again and again not just in the Jewish community, but any group that has been historically marginalized, is that people, I don't think, ever want to be or ever should be defined just by the worst things that have been done to them by other people. And so then what does that do for both Jewish like people, adults, children who are only seeing themselves portrayed in this way? And what does that then do for everybody else who is then limited understanding is only through this particular lens?
Thank you. I love that framing, that a people's story shouldn't only be told through victimhood, because there's so much more that surrounds the story, and this is just sort of one blip. It feels like in the case of the Jewish narrative, it feels like it's many little blips, but those many little blips don't and shouldn't overpower the overall narrative. And so I love that you bring that into the book. Just shifting slightly, because you mentioned sort of your personal work, and I'm curious, how have your own experiences shaped your understanding of Jewish diversity? And in that same vein, have you ever faced moments where you felt like an outsider in Jewish spaces, and how did these experiences inform your work?
Yeah, I've definitely had a lot of those. You probably have. No, never, ever. Um, Yeah, I mean, one that I've spoken about before that I think was a particular like ouch moment was during my confirmation trip. So like went through the confirmation process at the synagogue I attended growing up. And for like our class like overnight trip, we went to New York. Like went to Ellis Island, we saw Statue of Liberty, and then we spent some time in like the Hasidic neighborhood of Brooklyn. And one of our tour guides there was a rabbi who took one look at me and in front of like my entire class pointed at me and said that I wasn't a real Jew and that I never would be. And I really remember, I mean, like I'm really fortunate. I had really good friends in Hebrew school, and I remember some of my friends speaking up and like saying, like, that's not true, like that's really ridiculous. Interestingly, I don't remember like our chaperoning rabbi saying anything in that moment. But I remember that the rabbi who said that about me gave this example like, well, it's like if a baby is born like 1 foot over the border into Canada, and then right after they're born, they're brought back across the border to the United States. They still can't be president. I was like, that's a weird analogy. I don't know
Yeah.
if that works. And even as a teenager, I was like, I don't think that's like that really matches up to like what's happening here. But certainly in that moment in particular, like I felt like very small and very othered. And I, again, didn't really have, I think, a lot of the background knowledge or language or skills to really advocate for myself. And like I said earlier, just being in a lot of positions where when people would question my Judaism, I felt like I had to almost like overcompensate for it and just show just like how Jewish I was and mention things like, oh, I was like bat mitzvah, like, oh, I have family members who live in Israel, like my family keeps kosher, like all of these things that like really I shouldn't have to, I shouldn't feel the need to like show receipts in that way.
Mm,
Certainly felt the pressure to do so. And I think for a very long time, to your other question, um, I just constantly felt like I was the only one because there was not a lot of representation. I kind of just resigned myself to this idea of like, okay, well, I guess like I'm the only like Korean Jewish person out there. Like it's just me. And that's clearly not true. Like there, as you see, like from some of the stories and histories in the book, like there are these really beautiful, like incredible, like ancient histories of Jewish people all around the world, including like throughout Asia. But that certainly wasn't part of my own education. And like that was learning that I also had to do on my own as I got older.
thank you for that, and I'm sorry that you had that rabbi in Crown Heights say really not great things to you, terrible things, particularly in front of other people, because one thing that we know about Jewish tradition, it is severe to embarrass someone in a very public way. Um, and so I'm sorry that that experience happened. Um, and um, it feels like that experience is sort of as I feel it through the book in so many ways. I think you've done a really wonderful job of both bringing in these really rich stories. Um, some are fantastic to read, and you're like, oh, you're cheering the person on. And then some of them are a bit sad. Uh, and it just goes back to your point earlier of how, victimhood and all of these pieces are really wrapped up inherently within the Jewish story. Um, I'm curious how, when putting this together, how you balanced your personal story with the broader narratives that you're trying to highlight in the book.
Well, Caroline was an amazing partner for this project. I'm so sorry, and I wish she could be here because she's also just like such a dynamic speaker, and her voice is all over this book as well. And I feel very, very grateful and privileged to this day that she said yes to this project when I texted her. And here we are, like a couple of years later, and the thing like exists concretely as something that you can hold, and just like how surreal that still feels. Um, we have very different lived experiences. Caroline presents as white. She grew up in Texas. Like she grew up in a very close-knit Jewish community. And so like she felt, I think, very seen and very represented in terms of Jewish identity growing up. And I had a very different experience. Something that Caroline has also shared that I'm sure would be okay for me to share also is that she's also raising multiracial children. Her partner is Samoan, and so she's raising Samoan Jewish kids. I know she's thought a lot about the types of representation and stories she wants her kids to be able to grow up and see as young Jewish people in our country. And so thinking about like who and how we wanted to represent the 36 people in this book, we had like a really extensive spreadsheet. It's like the spreadsheet of all spreadsheets, and making sure that we had balance around gender, around race, around geography, around different career fields, people who have since passed away and people who are still alive, and just wanting to make sure that, regardless of how you identify as Jewish, chances are you could open this book and at some point like see at least one mirror reflecting you back.
I love that, and I would love to see that Excel spreadsheet because I'm always collecting these different stories and examples. So when I'm working with teens and young adults, and really any sort of Jewish organization that will hire me to do anything, I always want to bring in these different stories, and these different individuals to sort of put them within sort of the living museum of Judaism, so that people not only see that there are many ways to do and be Jewish, but to see that there are shining examples of these individuals that are out here living, breathing, doing um, Jewish work out in the world. So I love that answer. Do you think, in that same vein, do you think Jewish communities are becoming more open to these conversations? Why or why not?
I would say yes and no. I think that if you look at like the way that Jewish demographics in the United States are evolving, there was a really interesting study that came out of Stanford with Jews of color. I was published in 2021, and their findings revealed that between 12 and 15% of Jewish people in the United States also identify as people of color. I'm sure those numbers look also really different than they did 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And so our community is changing. The demographics and based on how people present and identify are certainly changing. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I feel like I was about to go on a tangent.
Oh, no, I'm always happy for tangents. The question was, are Jewish communities becoming more open to these
Okay.
conversations?
Okay, so I think in that way, yes, I do see more families, especially like in the school that I work at. I can think of in particular, like there's some Asian Jewish families, some Black and Jewish families I work with, and like there is this desire for more stories, more opportunities to really educate people about like the different identities that people can hold all at the same time. You're not like Jewish or something else. You're Jewish and you're also insert any other identity that you hold as well. And at the same time, especially I think since October 7th of last year, especially since conversations about DEI have been in the news quite a bit, and we've seen Jewish identity unfortunately misrepresented and weaponized in some pretty awful ways in schools, like K-12 schools and higher education. That I do think that when it comes to a book like this, that I'm sure some people might just slap the label of like, this is tokenism, this is just like false representation, this is, all of like
Mhm.
those buzzwords that people like to throw around when there happen to be like people of color or queer people in the room. Um, that there is some like discomfort and pushback there too. And I also just wonder, like, how can we then lean into these moments to be really curious instead of being really judgmental? Um, how can we really try to expand our own minds and really embrace this Jewish value of curiosity and wondering and dialogue with one another, which is honestly one of like my favorite things about being Jewish, about our culture and community.
Absolutely. I know that in addition to this book, you have a full-time career as a DEI professional out in the world. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on what or how can Jewish institutions better support individuals who embody these intersecting identities?
I think starting often with, what are the assumptions that you're making about people in your community? And that can exist along so many different lines of identity. When you create programming, when you are thinking about language that you use, if it's in event invitations or your language around High Holy Days programming or your Hebrew school curriculum, are you making assumptions that everyone presents as white or identifies as white in your community? Are you assuming that everybody has Ashkenazi ancestry? Do you assume that all families are two-parent, like cisgender, straight, like mother-father households? Are you assuming that the people in your community are not disabled, are all neurotypical, all have like a similar body size and things like that? And so I think starting with the things that we might assume about people who we are around constantly, create these moments where I feel like we can often call ourselves in and think, oh, wow, like this is maybe an aspect of privilege that I didn't realize that I had. And perhaps we are really missing some integral voices in the room to thinking about how we can create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for all Jewish people in our spaces. Um, Also, just wanting to note, I know that like when the word privilege comes up, some people have like big prickly feelings about that. And
Yes.
when I talk about privilege with both adults and with children, I just mean that there are certain parts of our identities that allow us to navigate the world with more ease and comfort compared to other people. And really, what's important in those moments is that we recognize the privileges that we hold and we think about how we then spend them to make the table longer for as many people as possible. It's not based on shame or guilt or just finances or skin color. Like it exists along all different aspects of identity.
You just painted a really beautiful image of people using their privilege to pay to make the table longer. I know for me and my work in the DEI world, where I'm always talking about bringing more people to the table. Um, and often explaining to people that there are often barriers to people physically coming into the door. Maybe the chairs are made for one kind of person, but not another kind of person. Maybe the table is too wide, maybe it's too short. So I love this image of people sort of using their privilege as currency to expand the table, to expand the tent, to as it were. So thank you for bringing that. I love that. There's a richness there that is fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think like I try to be very intentional with the word spend also because it's not something that should be transactional. Like it's not a loan that you give out. Like when you
Mm,
spend it, like it's out there. You shouldn't really be expecting to get anything back from that, which I think is a really important aspect of allyship that sometimes like gets kind of muddled.
ah, absolutely. Just shifting just a little bit. The book is filled with rich stories. I was surprised that I knew many of the people who are living in these books, and I was like, oh, let me text them and say, do you know about this book? You're in this book. I'm curious, how did you choose the stories and the individuals that you featured? And was there a story that surprised you or moved you the most?
I think we had a lot of fun doing this research, even just starting with like who are like notable Jewish people from like Central or South America or from like different countries in Africa or throughout Asia, and just seeing who popped up and who we were familiar with and who like was totally new to us. We wanted to make sure that there were people who really lived their Jewish values in really different ways, like
Mm.
what connects us and also what makes us really different and really diverse and beautiful as a community. And so if you have read the book, for folks, we decided to organize the book a little differently than some other biography like anthologies and collections are. So usually you'll see biography collections that are organized either chronologically based on when people lived and died, or they're grouped based on like what profession or field that they worked in. But for us, our chapters are themed by Jewish value. And so, for example, like Tikkun Olam is like an entire section. And like, let's be real, like a lot of these people could fit really easily into different categories. But we also hoped that even the themes of the chapters could become lessons or teachable moments for people to learn about Jewish values. Like, what do Jewish people actually believe? What do we try to embody? And so, if it's people who live their Jewish values through the arts or through activism or food or athletics, there should be hopefully something in here for everyone. There are two people who really stand out to me. Actually, I mean, there's a lot of people who really stand out to me. For some that I think I typically like to talk about the most. One is Ruby Myers, who was Indian and Jewish. She was one of the most famous silent film actresses in India during that era. She was just absolutely incredible, had such a beautiful career, and was somebody who I had never heard of before starting to research this book. Another person who I know Caroline also has very much admired, Victor Young Perez, who is from Tunisia, who was a boxer. Was like a boxing like worldwide champion, was sent to Auschwitz and unfortunately was executed because that he was trying to distribute food to his fellow prisoners like in secret. But he had just an incredible athletic career. He risked so much and never forgot like who he was and the importance of community in that, like even like these really dark, like very dire times of his life. Um, and then the last person is August Bondy, who's the second person featured in this book. And I love August Bondy's story because he's from Austria. He immigrated to the United States, and witnessed firsthand like the ugliness of chattel slavery in the Delta area, and became like a staunch abolitionist. Like his home became a stop along the Underground Railroad. He enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War when he didn't have to. And so I think also in terms of examples of white and like white presenting people, like not just Jewish people, but this is the type of activism and person trying to spend their privilege, trying to align themselves with people who are marginalized, and really also like continued to live his Jewish values, like celebrated Shabbat along like all of his travels and his work as well, which I think is just so incredibly cool.
Ah, I love that. I hope folks in the audience, if you haven't already picked up a copy of this book, as soon as this call is over, run, go pick it up because it really is just fantastic. I'm curious, are there any stories that in your research that you wanted to include that ultimately you just couldn't include?
Oh yeah, so many. So in the very back, because yes, we came up with way too many. There's even a spread of like more Jewish folks to learn about. So I think what we're hoping in this book is also that it's the beginning of learning and the beginning of some conversations. It's certainly not the beginning, middle, and end. And so hopefully this also like piques some people's curiosity. And if you'd like to learn more, here are some people we can like kind of point you in that direction.
I love that. Um, it's great. When I was looking at it, I was like, ooh, I don't know this person. I don't know this person. And now I have a spreadsheet of people that I'm looking up and trying to do my own personal research on. So thank you for giving me that push. I'm curious, were there any challenges you or Caroline faced in writing this book, particularly around trying to capture the vast diversity of Jewish life and Jewish expression?
Sure, absolutely. I think we know like a small community within the context of like the population of the world. But we're still very diverse, like within our community as well. Um, something that, and I'm sure you've probably run into this like in your work in DEI as well, is the challenges that come up when we've often been, I think, conditioned with a scarcity mindset because there is not a lot of representation and around like diversity in the Jewish community. When there is an opportunity to showcase this, so much stock gets put into like the very limited things that are out there. And so when we have the opportunity to have a book that really highlights the diversity of who we are, it becomes almost a scramble of if you have not been represented in a certain way before, certain books, movies, TV shows become like the end all be all of like, this must represent and reflect me exactly. And if it doesn't, then I hate it.
Yes.
And I think that just shows like there is this need for more, like again, like making the tent bigger, making the table longer. And so it doesn't feel like books like this become such high stakes projects because they then have to represent everybody perfectly all at the same time. And that's just not realistic. Like we could have multiple volumes of this book, but it is 36 people. And so, of course, we're going to be a bit limited in what we can accomplish in like a book that is also marketed towards like a middle grade audience. And so
Absolutely.
yeah, and so really just hoping that like more people maybe are inspired to also tell different stories within the Jewish community around Jewish identity and others, rather than it just being like, okay, this is the only chance that we're going to get, because hopefully that won't be the case.
Yes. Did you feel there was a tension between celebrating the diversity and risking tokenization of particular identity groups as you were putting this together?
Sure. I mean, I think we were really intentional and luckily like we had a really phenomenal team at HarperCollins. Our editor, Luana Hori, is absolutely amazing, like love her to death. Um, and the number of people who we also had put eyes on this as well to make sure that we were also being held accountable in all these ways too. We certainly don't want to put somebody in this book just because that they are Jewish. I think was something that Caroline and I came back to time and time again was this like what unites us in terms of Jewish values. And if we can't really make that connection, then this person probably doesn't belong in this book. Not to say they don't belong in another book or something like that, but maybe that just isn't like the right fit.
Thank you. I love that. Um, Throughout our conversation, you've gone back to this idea of Jewish values, and I'm curious for you, how would you define Jewish values? How does that look? How does that feel? How does that show up in the world for you?
That's such a good question. I mean, there are so many. I mean, I literally have Tikkun Olam tattooed around like across the back of my neck, which is like one of the first. And I think to me on a personal level, like what drives me so much in this work within writing, within DEI, within education, it's just the world that we have unfortunately created as humans is very broken in a number of
Mm,
ways. And my hope and goal is just to leave different aspects of the world and the things that I touch in it through work and relationships in just a little bit better condition than how I found it. And I think that that can be done in so many different ways too. But when I think about Jewish values, I think about our shared ancestry, the commitment to community and family and tradition. That in some ways, like, yes, like Judaism is technically a closed practice, but that doesn't mean that we've been closed off as a community or as a people. We have all these really beautiful examples of cross community solidarity and activism. Um, of Jewish people coming together with others throughout like our entire history as a people and how beautiful that is. But unfortunately, oftentimes those are not the stories that are being told or the things that people tend to see the most when it comes to like pop culture representation. So hopefully that this just helps people deepen their understanding a bit more there too and engage in some of like new learning and also unlearning.
I love that. Um, One of the things that I've been thinking about, both as we've been talking and having read the book, um, I'm curious how do you want your work to be used? Um, I know you said, it's how do you make a book that's really for everyone, but it's sort of for a middle school age sort of group. How do you see slash hope that people who pick up this book will use it, whether they are parents, educators, synagogue employees, administrators? would you like your book to be used?
That's a really hard question. Um, I don't think like there's a one size fits all. Like I hope all people engage with it in this way. I had heard stories from parents who were reading like one biography every night with some of their kids, and I love that idea of like kind of chunking it out. I have a friend who teaches high school who actually really loved the front matter because, like, at the very beginning, there are pieces I think that answer some of like the big questions that people tend to get wrong about Jewish people, of like, who are Jewish people, and like, what's an ethno-religion, and like, what is anti-Semitism, and things like that. But because this was written for a young audience, hopefully, if you can explain it to a child, like an adult should be able to hopefully understand it too. So I think it depends, like, um, there are ways to engage with this book when it just comes to like representation and joy and pride. I think that there are ways to use this if you are coming in really from like an entry level, like, I don't know anything position. And hopefully you're probably going to do a lot of like very intense learning in here too. Um, for me, like, I know that in my life over the past number of years, like, I've been very invested in my own healing and like
Mm,
work and what therapy looks like. And for me, like, getting to write this book was like one step and like one actually like enormous part in my own healing process of times where I had felt marginalized and othered, where I felt the need to defend my Jewishness, or I felt imposter syndrome in some of these spaces. And being able to actively contributing to my own healing process and healing my own trauma is just such an enormous gift that I could give myself. So that's how I'm using it.
well, it certainly is a gift that you've given us. As I was going through and both reading stories about people that I didn't know, stories of friends that I thought I knew particularly well, and then I learned something new about them in this book. Stories really have the power to connect and to heal people, and I think these individual stories in the book really have the ability to empower Jewish communities to embrace diversity and create more inclusive spaces. So you really have given, I think, not just the Jewish world. I think you've really given the world a real gift here. Um, and I'm just mindful of the time. I'm curious. After reading the book, do you have a call to action um, to those who have read it?
It would be awesome if you would gift it to somebody else, maybe. Um, I think, depending on where you sit or the identities that you hold, if you are a parent or a caregiver, you could give this book to your child's classroom teacher, to your child's school library. Like, as an author, it's always really helpful too if people can like request it at their public library as well. Yes, like we love it when people buy books, but we also love supporting public libraries and institutions too. Um, I think being able to engage people in like questioning and conversation, like going back to that, I like the importance of curiosity, even if it's like, oh, I didn't know this thing, I learned something, or I thought I knew something, and then I learned this other thing by reading this book, and now I think something else. Like, did you know this too? Um, there are so many ways to, I think, open up that conversation and that dialogue. And so I think just engaging by asking questions is a really great place to start.
I love that. And our tradition encourages question asking in such a way that it feels like the air that, we breathe, the butter on our toast, or the vegan butter on your toast, whatever you're spreading on your toast. Um, and I just love it. This book has been such a light for me. Um, and it has really been great, both to sort of see online people's sort of comments about the book of, oh, I've read this to my kindergartner and their class, and they were asking all of these really wonderful questions. And I love this idea of gifting it to someone else. Which I was like, oh, great! I've read the book. I now have this book. What do I do with it? As someone who doesn't have small children, and I don't work in a classroom at the moment. And I was like, oh, right. I live in an area where I can walk down the street and there are literally 20 different synagogues.
Actually, wait,
Um,
I have a better
yeah.
answer to
Yeah.
that question, if that's okay. Um, so I mentioned like this idea of like healing and like being responsible for
Mm,
this and like what we can actually, how do we like then bring other people's into this experience? Um, Something that I did recently that has been really helpful, I think, in times when I have felt very othered and like very isolated in my experience and identity. Being a Korean adoptee, there was a PBS Frontline documentary about like corruption in the Korean adoption industry. And I asked three of my friends, none of whom are adopted, to watch it and for them to try to develop a better understanding of my history, my own experience, and for us to have a conversation. And all three of them did it. And I have to say, like, it made me feel so seen and so loved and held by them. And like to
mm.
me, that was like a huge step in my own healing process too. It's feeling connected and feeling like people who care about me are invested in who I am and what I've experienced. And so I think if there are people in here who have been feeling very isolated since October of last year, and I bet there are a number of people, if there are non-Jewish people in your life, your friends, neighbors, community members, asking them to read this and then have a conversation with you and see what happens. It's something that I think is very doable and very manageable. Yeah, so just make the ask and see what they say.
Thank you. I love that. That is, I'm gonna make a note of that. Gonna be doing that right after this. Um, I'm curious, just in sort of our final moments before we open it up to the Q&A, how do you see the Jewish community evolving in the next 10 to 20 years when it comes to diversity and inclusivity?
Oh my God. Well, I think like the difference in generational experiences is pretty wide. Often when I do workshops and training, because I also facilitate and do a lot of public speaking on this too. I like showing pictures of people in my family and just kind of mentioning how Jewish identity has evolved so much from my grandparents to my parents' generation to me. And even within one generation, so much of that, the way that we see ourselves and the way that others see us, evolves and changes. And I think we're also seeing that quite a bit around the dialogue and discourse around everything that is happening in Israel and Palestine. That young people who identify as Jewish today, who are in high school and in college, are having a really different experience than perhaps we are. Like I'm in my 30s, the way that my parents and my grandparents also experienced this too. And so I think the need for like intergenerational connection and learning and
Mm,
conversation is really, really important too. I think we're definitely going to see a lot more diversity in terms of racial and ethnic identity. Obviously, people who identify as queer, who identify along a lot of different other lines of identity, like have always been here, but there is now more language, more opportunities for people to show up fully in who they are. And so I do think that, yeah, the makeup is going to change a lot. And I think the dialogue in a lot of our Jewish spaces is going to change too, hopefully for the better.
yes, from your lips to God's ears, hopefully for the better. I am going to take a moment to look at the Q&A function. Again, if you have questions that you'd like, feel free to put them into the Q&A. There's a little button on the bottom of your screen. So the first question, um, this person writes, I heard the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, who is quite important to Israeli politicians, states that there is only one kind of Jew. Is this true? And how does that matter to American Jewry?
I think I had not heard that statement before. I think I would ask, like, okay, and what kind of Jew is that? And if we even said that out loud here, like just looking at the 90 something participants that we have here, would even people agree with that? Like, because what's the saying, like two Jews, three opinions? Or like some people who might say things like, you know, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Like, what does that actually mean? Um, I think if there are people out there who identify as Jewish, either through like lineage or conversion, but you try to embody Jewish values in some sort of way, there's no one size fits all to that. And I also know that people will also really disagree with me on that too. I mean, even the rabbi who I mentioned from my confirmation trip had a really specific idea of what a Jewish person is and how a Jewish person looks. So he'd probably disagree with that. Um, So I think when it comes to American Jewry, it is also really challenging because we are the people of the diaspora, that we have Jewish people in our country who are Sephardic, who are Ashkenazi, who are Black, who are Asian, who are queer, who are so many different things. Um, what unites us is how we identify truly, like our common ancestry, some shared experiences, and it's kind of like the saying, same, but different. I
Mm,
think if you try to put everybody in one particular bucket, though, you do end up inherently marginalizing other people, though. And I would like to think that we're better than that.
I love that. And I would just add, if I may,
Please.
uh, I get this question. I'm really in between sort of the Orthodox world and the conservative world, but specifically choose to work in pluralistic Jewish organizations. And so I get to see a really wide swath of the Jewish people. And at the end of the day, the thing that binds us all together simply is the fact that we are Jews. Um, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, I am also not familiar with this statement, but it does sound like something that might come out of that office. Um, they're working under a very narrow definition of halachically who is, according to Jewish law, a Jew. And I think for many communities, that notion very much is real and lived for people. And for many others, it's like you're choosing to come to synagogue on a Saturday morning when you can be literally doing anything else. Or you're choosing to come to this dinner, you're choosing to come to this event. And by opting in to do these Jewish things, I think that is that's the thing that sort of binds us together. I used to work on a college campus, and I know that there were many Jewish college students who didn't feel the need to participate in organized Jewish community, um, not because they, had some sort of misgivings about the community, but because they were only around other Jews on a campus, and so they were like, "Oh, well, I don't need to come to Shabbat dinner at Hillel. I'll have a dinner that I won't call Shabbat dinner, but I will have a dinner on Friday night with challah, with wine, and like hang out with my friends and play video games." And it's just like really sort of getting people to see how people are doing Jewish and getting them to see that the way in which they're doing it is just a part of the spectrum of how to live, be, and do Jewish. Um, there's one question here, and I realize I don't think we explained what this was, but there's a question of what is DEI?
DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to break those down, diversity, just recognizing the ways that people might be different from each other across all different lines of identity. Equity, this idea that, which is different than equality. So equality, everybody getting the same thing. Equity, meaning that people get what they specifically need in order to be successful or to thrive in a particular environment or community. And then inclusion, which originally refers to people with disabilities, those who are neurotypical, but has really been expanded to just think about the ways that we bring other people in to be included so they can really function autonomously in any particular setting. Each of these things means something really different, but the acronym tends to stick together. Sometimes there are other words in there, like my official title at my school is Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Some people add in a J for justice in there too. There are a lot of different things. To me, like the work doesn't really change, though, depending on the acronym that you call it.
Absolutely. Um, here's a really great question. Without shaming someone, how can I help other congregants who might make a statement that is othering someone who does not look like their expectation of a Jewish person?
So I think like when calling somebody in, um, a good like 70 or 80% of the time, if you just ask the person to repeat what they said, they often will realize that they have said something that is like maybe not like the most tasteful. Um, and if that doesn't work, you can also say like, I'm sorry, like that sounded like a little bit stereotypical to me. Can you maybe help me explain like what you meant by that? I think coming from a place, like I keep going back to this idea of coming from a place of curiosity, is often far more effective than coming in with accusations and blaming people, because usually it is very hard, if not impossible, to learn when you're coming in from a place of shame. Um, you want to, at least as an educator, you want to be able to create teachable moments for people. And kind of similarly to what I shared earlier, I really love certain sentence frames where you're using your own learning as modeling for other people to show that like you too are an imperfectly perfect human and that you are also a work in progress. And so the sentence frame that I like to use is, I also like used to think, insert maybe problematic bias or belief. And then I learned, insert the thing that you learned. And like, this is how it's changed my thinking, and now I know something else. So you're also able to participate as a model in that learning process too.
I love that you use the language of calling in rather than calling out, and this idea of modeling for the other person. I'm also a firm believer in getting people to say the thing that they just said so that they can hear sometimes how outrageous what they've just shared is. But this idea of calling in, to me, really invites the person to do some real teshuva, some real deep reflection about this the sentence they just said, or this thing that they just did that really in many ways othered someone else that is a part of the community. And so I love that. Um, just going through the questions. Um, this might be a very easy question to answer. Is it possible to buy your book in bulk?
Yes, if you contact HarperCollins, their sales team should be able to help you with that. I can see actually if I can find the email for that on the back.
Sorry, I'm just going through.
I know Sherry is back, so that's our cue.
Oh, yes. Um,
Thank you, Tony and Liz.
and yeah,
Fantastic. Tony, was there anything else you wanted to add in before we left for the day?
yes, really just I want to express tremendous gratitude, Liz, to you and to Caroline and to Iris, who I know is the illustrator of the book. You really have given the world a fantastic gift, and I am going to do what I can personally to make sure other people get to enjoy this gift. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
And I would like to go ahead and thank the audience for joining us today for this wonderful talk of what does Jewish look like. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and impactful. We encourage you to explore more opportunities for learning by visiting open.aju.edu to register for upcoming events. Additionally, your support helps us continue offering programs like this one. Please consider donating to AJU Open so that we may continue to make these opportunities free for our global Jewish community. You can find that donation link in the chat now. Thank you again for being part of our AJU Open community, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. And thank you so much, Liz and Tony, for joining us today.